Hi guys, it's me, CHD, and welcome to another episode of the podcast, the first podcast episode of 2025. And of course, it is back to review the first Grand Prix of the year, the 2025 Australian Grand Prix that happened, of course, yesterday. And in this podcast, of course, we're going to be going over not just necessarily what happened in the race, but just the weekend in general, what we've learned from the first Grand Prix, and how things obviously look going forward, and obviously going through just what happened in the Australian Grand Prix. It was a very exciting weekend. The race obviously became very chaotic later on, but I think the weekend overall did set a good tone for the season, going on. Even though McLaren, who ended up getting pole and ended up winning the race, even though they clearly illustrated their superior advantage to everybody else, it was still a pretty wacky weekend, and it wasn't still that easy for McLaren to get the result they got. And like I said, that will be the common theme going forward for the season. We're going to have plenty of craziness happening over the course of 2025. But, of course, let's start the episode by going through the top 10 race results. Lando Norris winning the opening Grand Prix of the season. McLaren winning the Australian Grand Prix for the first time in 13 years. And also for the first time in 13 years that McLaren have won the opening race of a Formula One season. Absolutely brilliant and deserved, McLaren. They were clearly the best team pace-wise in Melbourne, certainly in the race. Max Verstappen finishing in second. Good job by Max. He nearly got the win in the end. Maybe if there was another couple laps, he could have got it, but he did a great job still to end up with the result he got and so close to the race win in the end. Third, George Russell. He'll be happy with that result. Mercedes will be very happy with that result. Kimi Antonelli from 16th to P4. He was demoted to 5th because of a penalty for an unsafe release, but then after a appeal by the Mercedes team, the penalty was removed. So Antonelli on his debut finishing 4th. What a debut race it was for the young Italian, who I think has already proved just how good he really is, and cannot wait to see more of him next weekend and for obviously the rest of his Formula One career. In 5th place, brilliant result for Williams with Alexander Albon. Really sets the tone ahead for their season, given how good of a car they do have. Lance Stroll in 6th. Good result for him and Aston Martin. Great result for Nico Hülkenberg, 7th in the Sauber. And as I said on my stream yesterday, that is more points for that finish of 7th place that they got of, 6 points you get for 7th place. That's more points than they got in the entirety of 2024. So, a brilliant start for them. Charles Leclerc 8th. Disastrous race, obviously, for Ferrari. 9th, Oscar Piastri. It was looking so good for Oscar, then it really just fell apart for reasons which we'll get onto. And then Lewis Hamilton in P10, Ferrari. 8th and 10th in the first Grand Prix. Around this track a year ago, they finished 1st and 2nd. Now it's 8th and 10th. Ferrari have much work to do, and trust me, we will get onto them before the end of this podcast. But some other things I want to go through, a couple things I want to go through before we start talking about the teams, is the first main thing we're going to focus on is the race pace from the Grand Prix. And the laps we're looking at for this data is in between the safety car that came in after the crash of, I think it was Jack Doohan and Carlos Sainz. That safety car eventually came in, and then obviously the next safety car came out around lap, 33, 34, something like that. So it's the laps in between those two safety car periods where we had the longest amount of green flag racing this is the race pace during that period, which gives us a decent indication as to how quick certain teams obviously were during the race, but are to an extent just in general. And McLaren were absolutely phenomenal with the pace they had. They were, at times, terrifyingly quick. Once Piastri passed Verstappen, McLaren, at times, were a second a lap slower than Red Bull. On average, though, it was a bit slower than that. But, yeah, the gap McLaren had over the rest of the field during that portion of the race, which was like a, 25, 30 lap-ish portion of the race, McLaren were on another planet compared to everybody else. Red Bull were the second best team. Mercedes and Ferrari were closely matched, but miles away from McLaren on pace. They weren't a million miles away from Red Bull necessarily, but Red Bull were second best on race pace. And then you can see the midfield teams after that, or, in and around Mercedes and Ferrari. But, I think the biggest indication from this data, or the biggest takeaway, rather, is just how quick this McLaren car is in race conditions. In qualifying, of course, they were very, very quick. They were 0.4 of a second quicker than the next non-McLaren car of Max and the Red Bull, and then Russell was 0.4 off as well in the Mercedes. If Ferrari had done their best possible qualifying lap, they would have been about 0.4 off as well. But I think the real domination from McLaren is when we get to the race. That's really when McLaren show just how unbelievably quick they are. And without a doubt, they have got the best car on the grid. Will it be the case for the whole season? I don't know. I don't think so, but we'll see. I wouldn't be surprised if McLaren, for the majority of the season, have the best car. But they are clearly comfortably ahead of the other three front-running teams. There is no doubt about that. And it's going to take a bit, and quite a bit of hard work, to catch up to McLaren. No doubt about that. Also, before we go into the performances and talk more about, say, the front-running teams, let's quickly do something slightly different from last year's reviews and actually go through the championship standings coming out of the first Grand Prix. Drivers' Championship side, obviously, it's the finishing order from the Australian Grand Prix. Lando Norris leading the championship for the first time in his career. And I think Lando is going to lead the championship. If he doesn't win it this year, he's going to lead it for quite a while, given how good McLaren look. No doubt about that. On the constructor side, McLaren at the top, but level on points with Mercedes. And that's why I was saying in my race watch along just how good of a result it was for Mercedes. Third and fourth, very good result considering how far off the pace they were of McLaren. And compared to last year, where they had a double DNF at this Grand Prix, it was really as good as it could have been for Mercedes in the race. So, yeah, a really great result. And if they can keep up maybe getting some podiums earlier on in the season, I think Mercedes will be very happy with that, especially if they can improve this car as the season goes on. Third, Red Bull, or Team Verstappen. The other driver in the Red Bull wasn't really present, was he, this weekend? Williams fourth in the championship, Aston Martin fifth, and then Sauber sixth, Ferrari seventh. Ferrari, not even the highest placed Ferrari-powered team in the championship. Yes, I know it's only race one, but still, that is very embarrassing. And then, of course, you've got Alpine, Racing Bulls, and Haas, the last three teams who did not score any points. Somehow Racing Bulls didn't score any points. Yuki Tsunoda was, I think, quite unlucky not to score a few points. He was one of the drivers of the weekend in Melbourne. But let's go on to the front-running teams and just how their weekends played out. And we will start, obviously, with the race winners, McLaren. In qualifying, they weren't looking necessarily through the entire session like they were definitely going to get pole. But then, right to the end of Q3, when they most had to show what their real pace was, they showed it. And God, was it good. A 1:15.0 for Lando Norris on pole position, way quicker than I was expecting the pole position time to be. And Max, 0.4 of a second off the pace, like Russell was as well on the second row of the grid. And McLaren clearly showed how superior they were to the rest of the field with that final qualifying lap. But as I said, when we were going through the race pace data, McLaren were even better in the race itself. Once we had enough green flag laps where McLaren and their drivers could just get their heads down and get on with it, the pace they had was just incredible, especially again once Piastri passed Verstappen. Verstappen obviously making that mistake at turn 11, which allowed Piastri through, which really helped the team. And then they pulled away at, it felt like a second a lap, if not more, during that period at times. It was just quite incredible. Max Verstappen, right before the next safety car came in, between lap 30 and 40, Max was nearly a pit stop behind the two McLarens. That is how quick McLaren pulled away from Max and the rest of the pack behind. So yeah, just very scary pace from McLaren. But then safety car came out. Both McLaren drivers went onto the hard compound tyre as the track was dry enough for the dry tyres. McLaren obviously were trying to get to the end. But then a big rain shower came out of nowhere. Both drivers went off at turn 12 it was, into the gravel trap and came back on. Lando Norris kept his car under control. Oscar Piastri did not and spun into the grass and took quite a while to get himself out of the grass. Thankfully did eventually, and I have to praise Oscar for not just giving up, because it would have been very easy to just turn the car off and say, right, that's it, because the race was lost at that point, and obviously he fell a lap down, but credit to him, and ended up coming back to get a couple points for ninth place, which still may be very important at the end of this season, whether it's for team or himself in the Drivers' Championship. But if we start with Oscar Piastri quickly, he had quite an eventful race. Obviously lost position to Verstappen at the start. Max just outsmarting him in turn 1 and 2. But then eventually Oscar passed Max once Max made a mistake under pressure from Oscar behind. You did feel, though, it was inevitable Piastri was going to overtake, because even though Max was keeping close to Norris to a degree, Oscar was just getting closer and closer to Max. And like I said, it did feel inevitable. And then once he got past, progressively got closer and closer to his teammate. Obviously, they pulled away massively from the field. And Oscar set about obviously trying to win the Grand Prix. But then his team called team orders and told Oscar to just lay back to a degree and hold position. Now, I've seen lots of people moaning about this, and I do think McLaren were wrong to call team orders that early in the race, but I can see why they did it, with the weather conditions being the way they were, and obviously the first Grand Prix, McLaren was so keen to make sure they at least won the race, and they didn't want to, have a double DNF through a collision or anything. So I understand their reasoning, but I just think it was too early to do that, and was not necessary at the time. But thankfully for McLaren, they didn't have to use team orders again, but sadly that was because obviously of the two McLarens going off, Piastri then getting stuck. Norris thankfully was able to keep his car under control enough to get back to the pits, get on the intermediate tyres, and then Lando was able to hang on for victory, despite some damage to his floor apparently, according to Andrea Stella, the McLaren team boss, which apparently is why Max Verstappen was able to close in on Lando at the very end of the Grand Prix, which is not surprising. But yeah, a bit of a shame about that whole team orders thing. But again, I can understand McLaren's position on that. But I said before the race in my race watch along stream, McLaren, with how difficult the conditions were going to be and how turbulent of a race it was going to be, McLaren just had to make sure at least they got the win. And that's what they did. So they got the win. They're technically leading the Constructors' Championship purely because they won the Australian Grand Prix. And pretty much all is good despite what happened to Piastri. Going forward, though, this Grand Prix is probably going to be the most eventful for McLaren in a while, because going forward, McLaren are going to win quite a few of the opening races. Next week in China, or this weekend in China rather, they will dominate the Grand Prix. I have no doubt about that. Whether it's dry or wet, spoiler alert, it's going to be a dry weekend. And of course, we have a sprint race as well, so even more points on offer, which is even better for McLaren because they'll be able to score even more points from their domination than they would do at a normal Grand Prix. But yeah, McLaren are going to dominate the Grand Prix this weekend. Don't be surprised if they are half a second ahead of the next best non-McLaren car. That very well could be the case in qualifying. And then in the race, again, dry or wet, I could see them ending up 25 or even 30 seconds ahead of whoever finishes in third place if McLaren secure a 1-2 finish in the race itself, which they should do, even though Piastri is a bit weaker at the Shanghai International Circuit than he is around Albert Park. Piastri should still be able to at least be, finishing off a 1-2 for McLaren. So, yeah, McLaren are going to, quite frankly, obliterate the field in Shanghai. It's going to be a very dominant weekend, and I would say pretty much the same goes for the Japanese Grand Prix in a couple weeks from now as well. I think McLaren will be easily the fastest team there as well. So McLaren, yeah, they are clearly ahead of the rest of the field and they are the team to beat. It's going to take quite a special and not miraculous job on the wind tunnel side, but some real big upgrades are needed from Mercedes or Red Bull or Ferrari if they're going to get on the same pace as McLaren. Because that McLaren car, that's a championship winning car, at least on the constructors' side. Whether it can be enough on the driver's side, we will find out, but it very well could be. And with Lando Norris, he could win a lot of these opening races, which may make him a bit uncatchable for the rest of 2025. We will see. But yeah, the rest of the teams have got to get their act together. Going on to Red Bull Racing, Max Verstappen, as I said, did the best job he could. Yes, he made the mistake, which let Oscar Piastri through, where he locked up the outside front tyre going into turn 11. If he had not made that mistake, yeah, he could have held up Piastri for a bit longer, but eventually Piastri was going to overtake. That McLaren was way quicker than the Red Bull. Evidence of that is obviously when Piastri did overtake, he left Max in the dust. So, for Verstappen to finish in second and only just behind Lando, I think he'll be very satisfied with that first Grand Prix weekend. Considering as well, remember, last year, Max obviously DNF'd from the Australian Grand Prix, didn't score anything. So to score at least 18 points when they don't have the fastest car, I think Max will be pretty satisfied with that. But he knows, and Red Bull know, that they've got to get upgrades on this car if they're going to win the championship. And Helmut Marko has come out after the Australian Grand Prix. He did say that between the third and fifth race of the season, they will be looking to close that gap, meaning they'll be bringing upgrades. And between the third and fifth race of the season, of course, is the fourth race of the season in Bahrain, which is in about a month from now, or just under a month from now. I think it's the second weekend of April. Upgrades won't necessarily show their full effect at that track, purely because of the nature of the Bahrain International, or the Sakhir International Circuit. It will show its effect probably more at the Jeddah Circuit a week after that. But if they do bring a big upgrade package and it gives them an extra 2 or 3 tenths of a second, might not still put them on the exact level with McLaren, but it will put them close enough to where Max can start fighting properly and maybe winning some races. So that's the race, really, from a Red Bull point of view, we need to wait for if they are going to win the championship, the Bahrain Grand Prix, in a few weeks' time. But yeah, the weekend overall, Max did the best he could in qualifying, did the best he could in the race, proved exactly why he is the world champion and why he won last year, because he maximised his effort over the weekend. And if he continues to do that race in, race out, may still make the difference over the course of 2025. For Liam Lawson, he was easily the worst driver, as far as I'm concerned, for the weekend. I know people say Oliver Behrman because he had lots of crashes in practice. Lawson, for me, was even worse. Lawson was in a much better car. Lawson, in qualifying, was pathetic, and then in the race, just as bad, and had zero pace. And Lawson was actually lapped by the 2 McLarens before, I think, the midway point of the race. That's how bad Lawson was. It surely can't get any worse for Liam this weekend in Shanghai, but God, has he got to step up, because Red Bull will get rid of him in a very brutal way and very quickly if he continues that level of performance, even for the next 2 or 3 races. Red Bull, we know how ruthless they are, so that cannot happen, really, too many times for Liam. But yeah, Red Bull overall, a good weekend. I think the best, really, they could have done performance-wise, with Verstappen, of course, who is the main man for the team. This weekend in Shanghai, I don't have great hopes for them. I think they can get on the podium. I think, especially with the form Verstappen is in, I think a podium is absolutely possible. They are not going to be anywhere near, though, McLaren. No chance. They're going to have to hope for McLaren having reliability trouble, or just completely throwing the race away with driver errors or something massive, because they are nowhere near, around a track like that, they are nowhere near the pace of McLaren right now. That is clear to see. Before we go on to the biggest disappointment, though, of the weekend, let's go on to Mercedes-Benz, who I thought had a pretty good weekend. George Russell, we'll start with him. 4th in qualifying, very close to being 3rd on the grid. I thought he did a very good effort in qualifying. And in the race, I've seen some people almost criticise Russell for doing nothing in the race, but I think that's really why he ended up getting such a good result in the end, because he didn't do anything. He didn't make a mistake, had decent pace throughout, and did exactly the job he needed to do. He was not as quick as Max, and Red Bull just had a bit more pace than Mercedes in the race. So, he did exactly the job he needed to do. So congratulations to Russell on a very good first Grand Prix. For Antonelli, obviously qualifying was a disaster, which he caused himself by damaging his own floor. Ended up 16th, and yeah, it was just so disappointing. But boy, did he make up for it in the race, finishing in 4th place, and clearly showing that he is special. It wasn't the best weekend for him. He will have much better weekends overall, where he's really good in qualifying and the race, rather than just the race itself. But he has shown enough to get us excited about his future, not just this year, but obviously, going forward for the rest of his career. And I think 4th place, considering where he started the race from, is a great result. And even, to be honest, even if he didn't have what he had in qualifying, if you had offered Antonelli 4th place in his opening Grand Prix, given how quick Mercedes are, I think he would have been pretty happy with that. Because Mercedes, I don't think, were really expecting to be, clearly in those type of positions, 3rd or 4th. But it's weird with the Mercedes. They're miles off the pace of McLaren, but I feel encouraged by what they have done this past weekend. A lot quicker than they were a year ago. Obviously, at the start of last season, they were, like a second a lap off the pace of the front runners. So they're a lot closer in qualifying trim, I think, at least, compared to the front runners. In race trim, still lagging behind quite a lot, but I think there is encouraging enough signs that Mercedes, I'm not saying they're going to win the championship, but I think there's encouraging enough signs that they are going to be very strong in that battle for, say, maybe 2nd and 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. And of course, they are already 2nd, level on points with 1st. So if they can just get maybe a couple more podiums in these opening, next few, 3-4 races, I think Mercedes would be pretty happy with that, especially if they can then bolt on an upgrade in, say, a couple months from now that gives them an extra few tenths of a second, and then maybe they can start competing for wins. We'll have to see. But yeah, I'm encouraged by what I saw from Mercedes-Benz, and I'm interested to see in Shanghai just how it goes. I do have a decent feeling about qualifying. I think if one of their drivers, especially Russell, if they can nail a lap, maybe he can cause a bit of surprise and get himself in the top 3. Antonelli, I wouldn't necessarily expect him to be right up there because he's never raced around that track before. But yeah, with Russell, again, if he can nail the lap, I think he could be right up there and maybe a strong podium contender. But we will see. At least they're right there with Ferrari and Red Bull, which this time last year, they were miles behind those two teams, and McLaren as well. It's just that gap to McLaren, which is making things look still not great. But again, encouraging signs if you're a Mercedes fan. There is no doubt about that. Let's go on, though, to, like I said, the biggest disappointment of the weekend, and that is undoubtedly the Ferrari team. Qualifying 7th and 8th, they had more pace in the car. If they had delivered the absolute best lap they could have, they probably would have ended up 4th, maybe 3rd at the absolute best, but more likely 4th on the grid. Still not great, though, considering, how they started the weekend, where they looked like they were going to be right in the fight for pole position. And then on Saturday, they were, in the end, absolutely nowhere near the fight for pole position, miles behind McLaren. And even when they were doing their best pace in qualifying, they looked to be about 4 to 5 tenths off. And then in the race, there was lots of copium from, I think, quite a lot of Ferrari fans that, they've got a wet setup on, they'll be fine. Very quickly, the race proved that that was not the case. And God, were they bad in the race. I think if you look at what happened late on in the Grand Prix, I think that's what people are focusing on a bit too much. In terms of, they stayed out on dry tyres on a wet track, then, fell from 1st and 2nd down to 9th and 10th, and then, ended up at 8th and 10th overall. What is more concerning, a lot more concerning, is that during that period where I showed the race pace data, where we had the longest period of green flag racing, they were running 5th and 8th, and they were so slow compared to McLaren. And even if you look at their pace compared to Red Bull, it was very disappointing. So I think that is really the biggest takeaway from me, or for me, from Ferrari, from the race in Australia, is just how far off Ferrari really are. And yeah, I know it's not going to be wet at every Grand Prix weekend, but them being that far off the pace in the wet, that was not because Norris and Piastri were just driving much quicker. We know Leclerc and Hamilton are very quick in the wet. That was because the Ferrari car, in wet conditions, just had nowhere near the level of grip that McLaren did, or even as much grip as the Red Bull. It just wasn't on the same level. And that is a concern, that grip-wise they are struggling that much in those types of conditions. And even in the few laps of dry running we had before the rain came down again, we're still miles off the pace. So in race conditions, Ferrari are really far off McLaren, to the point where I don't think Ferrari at the minute can even hope to compete for a race win. Even when we get to Bahrain in a month's time, a track that will suit the Ferrari car quite a bit more than probably the Albert Park circuit, they're still not going to be anywhere near quick enough in the race to actually win the race. And that, again, is my biggest concern. They are the most in need out of the front-running teams of an upgrade. And it's not necessarily just so they can get on the level of McLaren, purely just so they can get closer to McLaren. Because it looks like it's going to take maybe even more than one big upgrade. Might be 2 or 3 big upgrades if Ferrari are going to get to that point. But I am very disappointed in the performance level I saw from that Ferrari. That was the most concerning thing to me, was the genuine pace of the car seemed to be a lot slower and a lot worse than I was fearing coming into the season. In my season predictions, I did say I thought Ferrari for the first bit of the season going to be lagging behind, especially in the races. But yeah, this Grand Prix confirmed that to me, but it was even worse than I expected. So yeah, really not looking good for Ferrari, and it's not really going to improve that much in Shanghai. The only thing I will say is, even though they're going to be miles off the pace of McLaren, there is no doubt about that, what they need, even if it's just with one driver and the other driver is, low down in the top 10 or even out of the race, they need a podium this weekend, purely for the morale of the team. Because if they have another poor result and they're miles off the pace, the panic buttons will be pressed very quickly at Ferrari. So even though it's only the second race of the season, I do feel like this weekend's race is very important for Ferrari. Again, for morale. And this weekend's race, I think, will showcase a lot more just how far off McLaren they truly are. Because this weekend's track in Shanghai will suit McLaren more than it does Ferrari, and will work more in McLaren's favour than the Albert Park circuit that we've obviously just been to. So, yeah, I am really concerned with Ferrari and their performance. For the two drivers, Leclerc didn't have a good enough weekend. Qualifying, he just didn't deliver that final lap, which he should have. It really cost him in the end. And then in the race, I think Leclerc did the best he could most of the time, except for a couple little incidents he had. But the Ferrari just didn't have the pace. For Lewis Hamilton, from what I've seen so far, and yes, I know it's only been one race, but he was comfortably a lot slower than Leclerc. And that is a concern, because the level we saw from Lewis Hamilton in this Grand Prix and the weekend in general compared to Leclerc was just a continuation of what we saw in 2024. of him being quite a bit slower than his teammate and in a different race where Hamilton was, stuck behind Alex Albon seemingly the whole afternoon. So if he can step it up in China, then great. I hope he can, but I really am not encouraged by what I saw from Lewis Hamilton in Melbourne. I thought it was, from him, a very poor weekend. So, yeah, not good feeling with Ferrari. I just have especially about this weekend's race, I do have a bad feeling about how things are going to go. I hope I'm wrong. If they can get that podium finish, that, like I said, would be really good for the team as a morale boost and just to give them a load of extra points that they do need. That would be great. But if they end up with another poor result, then yeah. Questions, even after just 2 races, will need to be asked of just why are they so bad and so far off McLaren. But yeah, Ferrari, awful in the end. Before we come to the end of this podcast, though, I do want to shout out a few drivers. Yuki Tsunoda, I'd say, was probably one of the drivers of the weekend. Got to give him a shout out. I did not expect Racing Bulls to be anywhere near the top 10 in Melbourne, and Tsunoda was 5th on the grid. So, yeah, shows how much I know at times. And was running in the top 6 for so long, but then he just got caught out by staying on dry tyres when the rain came down in the last third of the Grand Prix. And because of that, and then he pitted, then the safety car came out, and then that relegated him right down the order, and he ended up finishing in 12th place. It was really quite unfortunate the way things worked out. So yeah, I'd shout out to him. He had a great weekend up until that point. Alex Albon as well, really solid, no errors, brilliant race performance, brilliant qualifying lap, and completely smashed to bits Carlos Sainz this weekend, who was, quite poor overall. So yeah, Albon, shout out to him, brilliant result. Great to see Williams scoring big points early in the season in the first Grand Prix. I am pretty confident they're going to have a good season. And like I predicted in my season predictions, I think they will be 5th in the championship this season. Credit to Stroll, even though I think with Stroll, he's just doing what he usually does. Has his really good wet weather performance, then he'll probably go back to being terrible. We'll see what happens. Hulkenberg, credit to him for being as competitive as he was in the Sauber in the race, and competitive enough to hold on to 7th place. Absolutely brilliant. And yes, Sauber, 6th in the championship. It's been a long time since they've been that high up in the championship. I think about 3 years at least for that team. Shame for Gasly in the Alpine that he made that mistake late on, because I think he would have ended up finishing ahead of the 2 Ferrari cars if he had not gone wide at turn 1, but he did and cost himself and ended up finishing in P11. But Gasly, I thought, had a good weekend as well. Alpine looking a lot better obviously than they did this time last year, and they will be obviously a factor in the midfield and should be decently quick this weekend in Shanghai. We'll see how things play out. But that is it, guys, for my review of the first Grand Prix of the season, the Australian Grand Prix. And remember, I will be back this time next week for another podcast episode reviewing the Chinese Grand Prix weekend. Just to let you guys know, though, my content plan for the rest of this weekend for the Chinese Grand Prix. I will be live on Friday night at 8 p.m. UK time to preview qualifying, which of course will be taking place on Saturday morning for us in the UK and Europe. And obviously going through the data from Friday and just giving you the best look ahead as possible that I can going into qualifying. And remember, I will not be doing a qualifying watch along on Saturday morning, But on Sunday morning, I will be doing a race watch along. I'll be live 2 hours before the race at 5 a.m. UK time. For then, obviously, the 7 a.m. UK time start of the race. And I'll be joined by Niblo, who's already confirmed to me that he'll be on commentary for that Grand Prix. And then, like I said, this time next week, there'll be a podcast reviewing the race in China. So still plenty of content coming your way, and make sure to smash a like button and subscribe for more content like this. And guys, until that content coming up this weekend for the second race of 2025, it has been me, Chazza HD. Goodbye.